Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start off with Alex Ingraham. Alex is an FLA board member and the chair of our Government Affairs Committee, and he's going to talk a bit today about what we're doing with that committee. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. As Michelle said, I'm Alex Ingraham. I'm the chair of the FLA Government Affairs Committee. Our committee is structured with a small group of member organizations, and the committee members are listed here. So we have good representation across the U.S. from the Pacific Northwest with Julia and Tiffany from Green Diamond and Roseburg. In the South, the Westervelt Company with Dave Donaldson, Andy Bars of Bars Industries, and Jimmy Bullock of Resource Management Services. And then Lynn Wilson in the Midwest, representing Wintertide LLC. And then I personally am from the Northeast in Maine with Pingree Associates. We also have a new member that will be joining us this year, Kathleen Ellis from Potlatch Deltec. For staff for the committee, we are joined by Craig Anderson, who is the Director of Government Affairs, who you'll hear from after I stop talking. And then Katie Moss, who is the Director of Stewardship Initiatives and Regulatory Affairs. So some of the things that we're looking at this year on the Government Affairs Committee, in particular, is the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill comes about around every 5 years, is what it's supposed to do. The timing of that is dependent on Congress actually accomplishing that. This year is the official kickoff of the Farm Bill in 2023. I'll let Craig fill in some details, but whether it actually gets accomplished in 2023 remains to be seen. But this is a piece of must-pass legislation, and as a result, it's an area that we can get some language into the bill that benefits forestry sector. Disaster reforestation has been a big focus for us for the last number of years, and the Farm Bill is a potential area where we can work that into an adjoining tax bill. So that remains a focus and a priority of the Government Affairs Committee. And finally, overarching of almost everything FLA does is property rights and regulatory burden, and making sure that what FLA is doing on a daily basis is helping protect property rights and assuring that we have the license to operate in our industry going forward. So that's a quick summation of where we are as a Government Affairs Committee. We meet on a monthly basis and go over kind of what's going on in Washington currently, some of our priorities in the areas that we are working on in both policy and on the regulatory side, and that is where Craig and Katie come in on the ground working for us. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Craig Anderson to give an overview of the government affairs and the policy happening in Washington. So with that, Craig, handing it to you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. As Alex said, my name is Craig Anderson, and I am Director of Government Affairs for Forest Landowners Association. And I've been thrilled to be in this job for the past few months and excited to get to know all of you over the next few months, and hopefully get to meet all of you in person as well shortly. Just a brief introduction about me. I am a graduate of the University of Alabama and reside in Jacksonville, Florida, which, fun fact, for those of you that don't know, Jacksonville is where FLA was founded. And previously, I worked on the Hill for Congressman Scott for roughly 8 years and had a lot of substantial work in the agriculture area because of his committee assignment, where I worked on the 2018 Farm Bill to get several pieces signed into the final law, as well as getting a disaster assistance package in response to Hurricane Michael and the California wildfires in 2017, and also worked for Georgia Forestry Association as their Director of Government Affairs, where I helped reform the state tax code to benefit forestry. So what I'd like to do next is to kind of give you the layout of the landscape that we're working with in Washington, D.C. And so many of you know the midterm elections last November delivered Republicans control of the House chamber. So no longer unilateral control by Democrats in both chambers. But what was interesting was, despite historical trends of the president's party suffering during midterm elections, congressional Democrats actually fared much better than analysts were expecting. None of the incumbent Democrats in the Senate lost, but the Pennsylvania seat was flipped, which allowed them to have control of 51 seats, with Republicans having the remaining 49, which was an improvement for them versus last Congress, which was a 50-50 split, when the vice president would have to preside over a lot of contentious votes and be the deciding vote on some occasions. And the House is controlled by Republicans, like I said, but with a much more narrow margin than previously expected. They have a 5-vote majority, which stands at there are 222 Republican members and 212 Democrats. And I'm sure that many of you witnessed the drama in the fight for the speaker bid by Kevin McCarthy. It took 15 rounds of voting until he did secure the votes he needed. That was a brief preview into what we might expect with legislation moving forward. And, I want to emphasize this is why bipartisan solutions and bipartisan champions in both chambers of Congress are so important. And so over the coming days and potentially weeks, the congressional committee rosters will be ironed out and finalized. And just given the split of Congress, we are going to continue to build and strengthen our relationships on Capitol Hill and identify power players that will and can push through policies that will help our membership. So next, I'm going to hit on opportunities that I see for FLA this year. And, before I dive into that, a question that many of you might have is, why is FLA engaging? So with a divided Congress, where it's harder to get bills through, and with a Congress that represents less family forest landowners because of redistricting, it's now, not later, that we need to engage, because it'll only become more difficult to educate and get people to care about the issues that matter most to us. And to even highlight that further, on the House side, where Republicans have finalized a lot of their committee rosters, only 9 of the 27 Republicans on the House Agriculture Committee were even in Washington for the 2018 Farm Bill. So 9 of the 27. And when it comes to the full membership of the House of Representatives, only less than half, 200 of the 435 members were in DC for the 2018 Farm Bill. So there's a big gap in education and outreach, but that's where I come in. And that's also when it's important that we engage with our legislators, which I'll hit on. The third item, the second item, disaster recovery tools, is pretty broad. Each year we face a series of natural disasters ranging from hurricanes to wildfires to pests that can devastate our family forest and their operations. And there is no silver bullet to help our members get back on their feet, but we will and we should advocate for legislation like the Disaster Reforestation Act, continued ad hoc appropriations for disaster assistance, and improvements to disaster assistance programs so that all of our members can participate and benefit from those federal programs. So it's imperative that we work with Congress to ensure we have the tools we need to bounce back so that our members can continue to be the economic engines that supply quality jobs, clean air, and fresh water for our country. And then finally, congressional engagement. FLA's key to success, it lies with our membership and the unique stories that they tell. And so what is imperative is that we build our congressional relationships, and we also utilize our members as witnesses for congressional briefings and hearings. And even if the opportunity allows, to host members of Congress out in some of our operations, to be able to engage with them and show them how our operations work and what they can do to be most helpful to us. So next, I'd like to hit more on the Farm Bill. And so for those of you that don't know, Alex hit on this previously, but the Farm Bill is essentially an omnibus. So a collection of multiple bills piled into one that governs an array of federal agricultural and food programs, mostly operated out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And since the 1930s, Congress has enacted 18 of these, and the most recent was signed into law in 2018. They're generally renewed about every 5 years, which gives the opportunity to help enhance, but also even axe certain programs to make sure that things are running efficiently for those that are using them. And as you can see from this pie graph, which will need to be updated potentially, a big chunk of the spending and the programs in the Farm Bill is delegated towards nutrition, but also the other large programs in there are commodity programs, crop insurance, and conservation. So some of the titles that we are interested in traditionally would be the conservation title, which encourages environmental stewardship, as well as land retirement programs and working land programs, but also the forestry title, which supports forest management programs run by USDA's Forest Service. And something important to note is that the Farm Bill, there can be any title you wish. It is contingent upon the crafters of the legislation. And so it is not uncommon to see things like a miscellaneous title, which I'm hoping we can utilize for bills like the Disaster Reforestation Act. Now, what's important is that we are going to be taking a multifaceted approach to work on this and advocate on your behalf. And so there are some broad forestry related initiatives that are supported by a coalition called Forest in the Farm Bill that we can all support as a united front. And that way we don't have to spread ourselves too thin. But we're also going to be leaning a lot on different legislators that are spearheading efforts like being sponsors of the Disaster Reforestation Act. So Democrat Alabama, Congresswoman Terry Sewell, and Republican in Georgia, Congressman Buddy Carter, as well as their Senate counterparts, Raphael Warnock and Bill Cassidy. And so now I want to touch more on disaster recovery. As I was saying earlier, there is no silver bullet, but we do identify several areas where we can make improvements. And first and foremost is the Disaster Reforestation Act. This is non-controversial language. It's, in fact, if you ever looked it up, it's 1.5 pages, which is pretty remarkable in Washington, D.C., where you can have a 5,000-page bill that has a $1.7 trillion price tag. And so this is a very easy bill for members to understand and digest, and one that we're looking at all possible avenues of exploring. And so in the slide, you'll see Chairman Stabenow and Chairman G.T. Thompson, and both of them will be chairing the Senate and House Agriculture Committees respectively, and will be key players when it comes to legislation that could be allowed into the upcoming Farm Bill, and ones that I think will be very open to allowing a bill that traditionally would not find a home in a Farm Bill, but has the opportunity to, with support from members like that. And other things that we'll need to continue to advocate for and support will be, like I said, supplemental appropriations for disaster recovery. There was money allocated in the government funding bill, the $1.7 trillion bill that I mentioned, that will help those seeking some of the disaster assistance programs. But there are more natural disasters that likely will happen this year and next year. And it's important that we find some certainty with future disaster recovery packages and ones that can help potentially codify block grants for timber and other things that could be helpful. In addition to that, being able to work with Congress and also USDA to make technical improvements to the programs that are generally disaster assistance, like the Wildfire Hurricane Indemnity Program, the Emergency Forest Restoration Program, EFRP, and the tree assistance program, because sometimes it's easier to make improvements rather than reinvent the wheel. And next, I would like to kind of talk about some other issues that we will be monitoring that likely will take up a lot of oxygen. And the first, many of you all have probably seen, is the debt ceiling. And so, as many of you know, there is a cap on spending that the US can spend. Although we do print money like there's no tomorrow, there is a limit. And the US Treasury has already announced this month that it's using extraordinary measures to keep us from defaulting on our debt. And so this is nothing to be alarmed about. This happens very often. In fact, the most recent time, 2 years ago, we raised the debt limit twice. And so this is a negotiation that happens between the top leaders in the House and the Senate with the president. And while there were some hiccups where it was saying that the president did not want to negotiate with the new Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, they've already announced that they will have a meeting to resolve those issues, because debt ceiling, default, not good for anybody. And of course, the more time spent on that, the less time that could be spent on Farm Bill and considering legislation like Disaster Reforestation Act. Second item, congressional oversight and investigations. So oversight is a pretty routine way for Congress to conduct business, where they review legislation like the 2018 Farm Bill and its implementation, but also other large pieces of legislation like the Infrastructure Act. And there were certain programs in there that could benefit forestry. And so that is something that you're going to see a lot of the committees, especially in the House, now that Republicans have the gavels for those chairmanships, that they will be conducting their congressional duties with. But you'll also see a lot of investigations as well that might tie in to some of those large pieces of legislation, and also other investigations that might be unrelated to forestry and things that matter to us. And finally, last but certainly not least, is the 2023 Farm Bill. And so one thing that I will need to focus on, and a lot of my counterparts and other associations and organizations, is reemphasizing how important it is to get the Farm Bill reauthorized, but also putting important legislation that really benefits our members in rural America in there. Because the Farm Bill does have a deadline, and it's September 30th of this year. And that is nothing for alarm, because in 2018, they missed the initial deadline and had a brief extension of current law, and were able to finally iron everything out within the same year of introduction. So we're looking at a pretty similar timeline, where Q1 of this year is when House and Senate committees are putting their policy proposals forward. Q2 is when we expect to see actual language and movement within the committee's jurisdiction, potentially marking up the bills, passing them through the committees and through the respective chambers. And Q3 and Q4 is when we look to see much more action through the chambers, and hopefully getting signed into law as well. And so that was a very brief overview of what I'm looking to accomplish this year, but certainly just appreciate working with all of you, being your eyes and ears in Washington, D.C., and for our family forest landowners. And next, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Katie Moss, who's FLA's Director of Stewardship Initiatives and Regulatory Affairs.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So, hey, everybody, my name's Katie Moss. As Craig said, I'm the Director of Stewardship Initiatives and Regulatory Affairs for FLA. I have been with FLA for a little over 2 years now, but before I started this role, I worked in the Government Affairs Department of the National Wild Turkey Federation, and I also worked in an education and outreach capacity for the Nature Conservancy down in Mobile, Alabama. I'm a graduate of Mississippi State University, and I still reside here in Mississippi in a little town called Van Vliet. And so, yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit more about just the regulatory side of the forest policy that we are going to be working with in 2023. So to start out, I want to briefly touch on the Biden administration's unified agenda of regulatory and deregulatory actions that was released in early January. So this is basically a list of federal actions, which is separated by agency, that are planned for the near and the long term. And so having access to this agenda will help us at FLA be able to anticipate just some of the upcoming regulatory actions before they're officially announced in the Federal Register. So this includes everything from species listings and critical habitat designations to, updates of ESA regulations overall, water regulations, just anything along those lines. So I've included a few screenshots of just sort of how to navigate this agenda in case anyone was interested in looking at it for themselves. But a few things that jumped out to me as I was looking through this agenda were waters of the U.S., of course, which I'll talk more about here in just a minute. We're expecting a final rule regarding the experimental populations proposal that the Fish and Wildlife Service released last year that would allow them to establish experimental populations outside of their historic range. That's something that we followed really closely last year when it was proposed. And so that final rule is expected this year. They're also expecting to finalize some Endangered Species Act regulations in response to Executive Order 13990, which worked to repeal or revise certain Trump era ESA regulations. So we're expecting some final rules on that front. And then just, the typical species and critical habitat designations, a few that stuck out were Florida pine snake, scheduled for this year, little brown bat, lots of mussels and crayfish, which we see every year. But we at FLA will be keeping track of these things as they come up. So what I really want to talk about is how we're going to tackle the things that are on this regulatory agenda and what's beyond this regulatory agenda. So at FLA, we know that collaboration, education, and relationship building are all really key to achieve common sense conservation that leads to good species outcomes and environmental outcomes, while also respecting landowners' private property rights. So there's some really great opportunities this year to continue building those relationships, finding new ways to collaborate with the agencies, and just making sure that the agencies and the administration understand the importance of private working forests. So we'll continue this year and on into the future working with the agencies to find new and more effective methods to conserve species and natural resources that are not regulatory in nature. So promoting these voluntary collaborative incentives that lead to better outcomes for all parties involved. And we will also continue working to reform burdensome regulations that negatively impact private landowners and serve as disincentives to collaborative conservation, whether that's related to species or old growth or water or anything else that 2023 might throw our way. Then outside of the regulatory agenda and what we sort of know to expect on that front, there are a few other things that we'll be doing to promote collaborative conservation in 2023. So just a few things to highlight now. This year is the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. And we've come a long way over the past 50 years to mend some of the disconnect that has historically existed between agencies and landowners. We want to highlight on those successes, the delistings, the downlistings, the successful collaboration, and just, highlight how the general approach to species conservation in recent years has, in most cases, started to rely more on collaboration and recognizing the benefits of private working forests. Another thing that we're doing this year is FLA is serving on the Species Status Assessment Committee for the Eastern Diamondback rattlesnake to help the service determine whether that species warrants listings. So we're working with our landowners to provide data from the field and working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that they understand the private landowner perspective throughout this process. And, that's one of those things that we want to continue to do for other species as well, not just the rattlesnake. And then another thing that we're working on is with the Forest Service as they're crafting their approach to old growth. So they've actually reached out to us wanting FLA to be involved in roundtables and, other stakeholder communications going forward, just to make sure that they are wrapping their heads around their approach to old growth, even though it's focused on federal lands, how it may impact private landowners and their operations. So those are just, a few of the things that we're looking forward to in 2023 that we're going to be collaborating with the agencies on. I did want to take some time specifically to talk about one of the issues that I think is at the top of a lot of people's minds right now, and that is the final Waters of the U.S. rule that was released at the very end of December. So I wanted to give a little insight on that rule, if we could go to the next slide for that. So this new final rule for waters of the U.S., it starts with the pre-2015 framework as a guide. So it's very similar to the regulations that we were following before the Obama era Clean Water Rule. And this final rule attempts to sort of thread the needle and find a middle ground between the Obama era rule and the Trump era Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The key difference, though, is that there is broader language for the two tests that determine jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. So those two tests are the significant nexus test and the relative permanence test. So the significant nexus test was broadened in geographical scope, meaning that the agencies will look farther to see if a water or a wetland has a significant ecological impact on a larger navigable water. The test doesn't have really any numerical limits to how broad that geographical scope will be, meaning that they will determine that on a case-by-case basis. With the relative permanence test, it also has some broader language. So now it will encompass any water that flows or has standing water more than just in direct correlation to a precipitation event. Again, no bright line quantitative cutoffs, and this will continue to be determined on a case-by-case basis. So what does this mean for landowners? Obviously, continued regulatory uncertainty when a landowner is trying to figure out if water on their property falls under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. Also, broader language for these two tests, of course, means more headwaters and wetlands that may fall under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, which may trigger additional PGP compliance, other necessary permits to do stand maintenance, also increased exposure to citizen suits, and potential impacts on water quality standards, which may have a domino effect on water regulations beyond just waters of the U.S. So that's something that we're going to be keeping an eye out for. So even though this final rule will officially go into effect on March 20th, the language in the rule may still be subject to change. So the Supreme Court ruling in the Sackett versus EPA case, which we anticipate will be announced this summer sometime, may set a new precedent for determining what's considered a water of the U.S. The unified agenda that I highlighted earlier also includes further refinements to the rule as early as November of this year. So we will keep watching how this rule takes shape and engaging where it's necessary. We also have a good article on our website that gives a little bit more detail about waters of the U.S. and also links to some other resources that may be helpful as we're all trying to kind of wrap our heads around this 500+ page rule and what it means to landowners. So just wanted to highlight that for you all. And yeah, so that's kind of the regulatory landscape that we're working with. With that, I guess I will turn it over if we want to start the Q&A session.
Hi all, if anyone has a question, please put it into the Q&A chat or into the regular chat, and we can monitor both. And just want to thank both Katie and Craig for a great presentation. Looks like you guys might get away easy without any tough questions.
Well, it just means you did an outstanding job on your presentation.
Thanks.
All right, well, seeing no questions, I think we can wrap this up. As always, if there's any questions, please let our staff know. The foundation is also available for outreach as well. So as you saw, the emails for Katie and Craig are there, and Scott is always available to the members, as is Amy and Michelle. And it's been my pleasure to host this webinar as the chair, and look forward to seeing you all in DC or out in the forest, preferably the forest.
Thank you, everybody, for your support. Appreciate your membership.
Thanks,
Thank
Good
you.
everybody.
job, everyone.
Have a good one.
Thank you all.